Number 1. Jose Antonio Ibarra. A young nursing student laces up her running shoes before sunrise. She has run this same wooded trail on the University of Georgia campus dozens of times before. She never comes back. What happened to Laken Riley in the span of roughly 30 minutes on a February morning would trigger one of the largest campus manhunts in modern American history, a nationally televised trial, and a debate that reached the floor of Congress and, ultimately, the desk of a president. This is that story. Laken Riley was 22 years old, a nursing student at Augusta University's Athens campus, remembered by her sorority sisters as disciplined, driven, and quietly kind. On the morning of February the 22nd, 2024, she set out for a run through the wooded intramural fields near the University of Georgia campus in Athens, a route she had used many times before. When she failed to return and didn't answer calls or texts, friends grew alarmed and alerted police. Officers traced her phone's last known location to the trail system, and within hours, searchers found her body in a wooded area just off the path. Investigators moved quickly. Surveillance footage from the area placed a man near the trail around the time Laken would have been running, and that footage, combined with physical evidence at the scene, led police to Jose Antonio Ibarra, a 26-year-old man who had entered the United States without legal authorization roughly 2 years earlier and had been living in the Athens area, working odd jobs. Forensic examiners found injuries consistent with severe, repeated blunt force trauma to Laken's head, and DNA evidence recovered from beneath her fingernails and elsewhere on her body was matched to Ibarra. He was arrested less than 24 hours after her disappearance was first reported, still in the immediate area, having made no real attempt to leave town. Investigators later noted that Ibarra had a prior arrest on his record from an incident in New York involving a shoplifting charge and an allegation of child endangerment, a record that would become central to the political debate the case ignited, since Ibarra had already been released into the country to await future immigration proceedings before Laken was ever killed. The trial began in November 2024 in Athens Clarke County Superior Court, and it arrived already carrying enormous national weight. Laken Riley's name had been invoked on the floor of the United States Capitol, cited in a presidential address, and turned into shorthand in a broader, deeply contentious national argument over immigration enforcement policy, an argument Laken's own family would later say they never wanted their daughter's death to become a symbol for, even as they also pushed for policy change in her name. Ibarra waived his right to a jury, choosing instead a bench trial decided by a judge alone, a strategic decision his defense team never fully explained publicly, though legal observers speculated it reflected a calculation that a judge would be less swayed by the case's political charge than a jury pulled from the same community that had spent months grieving Laken and debating her death on cable news. Prosecutors built their case on the physical evidence: a fractured skull, defensive wounds suggesting Laken had fought desperately, and DNA placing Ibarra unmistakably at the scene. Investigators also testified about tracking Ibarra's movements through cell tower data, and matching soil and vegetation found on his clothing to the specific stretch of trail where Laken's body was found. The defense tried to introduce doubt by pointing to a partial, unmatched DNA profile also recovered from a scene, suggesting a second, unidentified person might have been involved, an argument the judge ultimately found unpersuasive against the weight of the rest of the evidence, noting that unmatched trace DNA at outdoor crime scenes is common and not, on its own, exculpatory. On November the 20th, 2024, Judge Haggard delivered his verdict from the bench, guilty on all 10 counts, including malice murder, felony murder, kidnapping with bodily injury, and multiple counts of aggravated assault and battery. Georgia's malice murder statute carries a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment, and prosecutors, while not pursuing the death penalty, asked for and received the maximum available outcome. Ibarra was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, plus additional consecutive years on the remaining counts, a sentence that guarantees he will die in a Georgia prison. What made this case resonate so far beyond Athens was not only its brutality but its randomness. Every account presented at trial made clear Laken Riley was not targeted because Ibarra knew her. She was simply present on a trail he also happened to be on that morning. In the aftermath, her family launched a foundation focused on campus safety and self-defense education for women, determined that something durable might come from a death that otherwise offered them no explanation. Congress, moved by the case, passed federal legislation bearing her name in the months that followed, requiring federal detention of undocumented individuals charged with certain theft and violent offenses, legislation that remains, itself, a subject of continuing political debate. What is not in dispute is the legal outcome for Laken Riley's killer, convicted on every count, sentenced to life without parole, and confined for the remainder of his natural life, with no parole board that will ever again consider releasing him. Number 2.
Cristian Baena Rivera.
A 20-year-old college student goes for an evening run in small-town Iowa and simply vanishes. No scream is heard. No struggle is witnessed by anyone willing to come forward. For 34 agonizing days, a search involving hundreds of volunteers, cadaver dogs, drones, and the FBI turns up nothing at all. Then the case breaks wide open, and the answer had been circling the same block the entire time. This is the story of Molly Tibbetts. Molly Tibbetts was a University of Iowa student home for the summer in Brooklyn, Iowa, a small farming town where, by every account, everybody knew everybody. On the evening of July the 18th, 2018, she went out for her usual run and never returned to the house where she was staying while dog-sitting for her boyfriend. When she failed to show up for work the next day, he reported her missing. What followed was one of the largest missing person searches in Iowa's history. The FBI, the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, and thousands of local volunteers combing cornfields, ditches, and waterways for more than a month, driven as much by a small community's refusal to give up hope as by any hard lead. Reward money for information climbed into the hundreds of thousands of dollars as the weeks dragged on without a single solid break, and national cable news crews descended on Brooklyn, a town of fewer than 1,500 people, turning a local tragedy into a coast-to-coast media event. The break came in August, when investigators released surveillance footage of a black Chevrolet Malibu seen repeatedly circling the block where Molly had been running the night she vanished. That car belonged to Christian Bahena Rivera, a 24-year-old man who worked at a nearby dairy farm, Yarrabee Farms, a business whose owner was a prominent local political donor, which would later fuel controversy over how Bahena Rivera had been hired and verified for employment in the first place, since he had reportedly used another man's identity documents to secure the job. Investigators revealed he had been living and working in the country without legal immigration status for years under a false identity. When confronted, he initially denied any involvement, then changed his account several times before finally leading investigators to a cornfield where Molly's body had lain concealed beneath cornstalks for more than a month, discovered only because he chose, at last, to show them where. According to Bahena Rivera's own statements, he had approached Molly while she ran, and when she pulled out her phone and threatened to call the police, he panicked and attacked her. He claimed to have blacked out during the assault itself, professing no clear memory of the moment she died, only of returning to awareness with her body in his car. He then drove to the remote cornfield, hid her, and returned to ordinary life at the dairy farm for over a month while an entire state searched for the young woman he had killed, even reportedly joining search efforts and speaking with reporters covering the case. The trial, moved to Scott County after a change of venue due to pretrial publicity, began in May 2021. The defense mounted an unusual and ultimately unsuccessful theory that two unidentified masked men had ambushed Bahena Rivera and forced him, at gunpoint, to help dispose of a body they had already killed. Prosecutors dismantled that account using forensic evidence, cell tower data, and the defendant's own shifting statements to investigators, pointing out that no physical evidence of any third party was ever recovered from a vehicle, the cornfield, or Bahena Rivera's own account of the night. The jury deliberated roughly 8 hours before convicting him of first-degree murder. In August 2021, Bahena Rivera was sentenced to life in prison without parole, the mandatory outcome under Iowa law. Molly's father, Rob Tibbetts, gave a widely covered statement during the search that pointedly thanked the Hispanic community of Poweshiek County for their tireless help finding his daughter, a statement many understood as a deliberate rebuke of efforts to politicize her disappearance along ethnic lines even before any suspect had been named, and one he reiterated even after Bahena Rivera's immigration status became public, drawing both praise and criticism from opposite ends of the national political spectrum. The case nonetheless became, like several others in this list, a fixture of national political debate for years afterward, cited repeatedly in state and federal legislative fights over agricultural employment verification requirements. What remained settled, regardless of how that debate continued, is the legal outcome. Christian Bahena Rivera sits today in an Iowa prison, serving a sentence with no parole eligibility whatsoever for the murder of Molly Tibbetts. Number 3. Angel Maturino Resendiz, known to the press as the Railway Killer. A pediatrician and geneticist is found bludgeoned to death inside her own home, killed with a statue that had sat, until that moment, on her own mantelpiece. Elsewhere, bodies keep turning up near stretches of railroad track, scattered across 9 states over more than a decade, and for years, nobody connects them. Then one man's own family makes the call that ends it. This is the story of the Railway Killer. Angel Maturino Resendiz was a Mexican national who crossed into the United States repeatedly over more than 10 years, using the country's freight rail network to travel undetected, Hopping trains gave him access to isolated homes and small towns near rail corridors all across the country, without the highway checkpoints or bus terminal cameras that might have exposed him. Beginning in the 1980s and escalating sharply through the 1990s, he committed a string of murders that, for years, were investigated as unrelated local crimes in separate jurisdictions, until the pattern, nearly every scene within walking distance of active rail lines, finally connected them. Resendiz had also been deported multiple times over the years and had an extensive prior criminal record in both the United States and Mexico, including previous convictions, a fact that later fueled sharp criticism of how many opportunities existed to detain him permanently before the killing spree reached its worst years. Among his confirmed victims was Dr. Claudia Benton, a pediatrician and Baylor College of Medicine geneticist, bludgeoned to death in her home near Houston in December 1998. Her body was found by a family member, and her own car was later recovered abandoned near a rail yard, the same signature investigators would come to recognize across multiple states. Other confirmed victims included Selena Thompson, found near railroad tracks in Texas, and at least 7 others across Illinois, Kentucky, Texas, and Florida, with investigators believing the true toll may have been higher still, a question later left permanently unresolved. Several of his victims were killed in their own homes located near rail lines, while others appeared to have been encountered near the tracks themselves, suggesting Resendiz sometimes selected targets opportunistically rather than through any extended surveillance or planning. The manhunt became one of the most significant serial killer investigations of the late 20th century, earning Resendiz a spot on the FBI's 10 most wanted list with a $125,000 reward. What ended it, in the end, was not a forensic breakthrough but a family's intervention. Resendiz's own sister, working with a Texas Ranger and an FBI negotiator, convinced her brother to surrender, assuring him he would be treated fairly. In July of 1999, he walked across the border bridge into El Pozo and turned himself in, ending a manhunt that had, at its peak, involved law enforcement agencies in nearly a dozen states comparing notes on unsolved deaths near their own local rail lines. He was tried specifically for the murder of Dr. Benton, the case prosecutors judged strongest, and in May 2000, a Texas jury convicted him of capital murder. Resendiz's courtroom conduct during trial was erratic and often disturbing. At one point he addressed jurors directly with rambling, quasi-religious statements, and his defense raised questions about his mental competency that neither the trial court nor subsequent appeals ultimately accepted as grounds to spare him. He was sentenced to death. Resendiz spent 6 years on Texas's death row before his execution by lethal injection on June 27, 2006, at the Walls Unit in Huntsville. His final statement offered a vague expression of seeking forgiveness but no explanation for a killing spree spanning nearly a decade. To this day, investigators continue to wonder whether other unsolved deaths near rail corridors from those years belong to him. Questions that, with his execution, will now never be conclusively answered. What is answered, permanently, is whether Angel Maturino Resendiz will ever kill again. Number 4.
Luis Bracamontes.
2 law enforcement officers, in 2 different California counties, are shot dead within hours of each other by the same man on the same afternoon. Years later, when he finally stands trial, he does something almost no capital defendant in an American courtroom ever does. He smiles, laughs, and tells the jury directly that he wishes he'd killed more of them. This is the story of Luis Bracamontes. On the morning of October 24, 2014, Sacramento County Sheriff's Deputy Danny Oliver approached a parked car in a motel lot to conduct a welfare check. The driver, Luis Bracamontes, a Mexican national who had already been deported from the United States twice before and had illegally re-entered each time, opened fire without warning, killing Deputy Oliver almost instantly. Bracamontes fled, hijacking vehicles as he went, leading police on a pursuit that crossed into neighboring Placer County, where he shot and killed Placer County Sheriff's Detective Michael Davis Jr., who had joined the chase after hearing radio reports of the first shooting. A third officer was wounded before Bracamontes was finally cornered, still armed, and taken into custody after a manhunt that shut down major roadways for hours and put the entire region on lockdown, with schools ordered into shelter-in-place protocols as the search unfolded. The case took years to reach trial, delayed repeatedly by competency hearings after his defense argued he suffered serious mental illness, a claim mental health evaluators, and ultimately the court, did not accept as a bar to prosecution. When the trial finally opened in Sacramento County in early 2018, the evidence itself, eyewitness testimony, ballistics, Bracamontes' own recorded statements, was overwhelming and barely contested. What made the trial infamous was the defendant's conduct. He repeatedly smiled and laughed during grieving family members' testimony, and in one especially notorious outburst, told the jury outright that he wished he'd killed more officers, a statement prosecutors used with devastating effect during the penalty phase to argue there was no remorse to weigh, no rehabilitation possible. His wife, tried alongside him on related charges for her role in the aftermath of the shootings, was convicted separately on lesser charges. The jury convicted him of 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, along with numerous related charges, and in April 2018 recommended the death penalty, formally imposed by the trial judge. Bracamontes remains today on California's death row at San Quentin. Because California has maintained an official moratorium on carrying out execution since 2019, his sentence functions today mainly as a legal marker of the crime severity rather than an imminent event. But for public safety, the practical result is identical. Louis Bracamontes will spend every remaining day of his life behind bars, with no parole under either the sentence or California law governing death-sentenced inmates. His documented prior deportations made the case a recurring reference point in congressional hearings and campaign speeches on immigration enforcement for years afterward, and footage of his courtroom outbursts continues to circulate widely online to this day. Number 5.
Wilber Ernesto Martínez Guzmán.
In the span of a single week in January 2019, 4 people in rural Nevada are shot dead inside their own homes, across 2 separate residences, with no obvious link between the victims beyond geography. Investigators fear a killer is moving through quiet neighborhoods at random, and the fear-gripping Douglas County becomes almost unbearable, until one piece of forensic evidence cracks the case wide open. This is the story of the Nevada quadruple homicide. The first 2 victims, Gerald David and Sharon David, a married couple, were found shot to death in their Gardnerville, Nevada, home on January 10, 2019. Days later, in a separate nearby residence, the bodies of Sophia Renken and Connie Kuntz were discovered, killed in a strikingly similar manner. Investigators quickly recognized the connection. Both scenes shared the same method, and at both, valuables sat untouched, ruling out robbery and deepening the mystery of what had driven the killer to these specific homes. Local residents in the small, close-knit communities of Gardnerville and Cold Springs describe a rare and unfamiliar dread settling over the area, with many reporting they had begun locking doors that, in normal times, stayed open all day. The break came through firearms evidence. Investigators traced a stolen weapon and matching ammunition back to Wilber Ernesto Martínez Guzmán, a 19-year-old man who had entered the United States without legal authorization roughly a year earlier and was living in the Carson City area. Douglas County investigators, working with state and federal partners, arrested him within days of identifying him, recovering stolen property and firearms tied directly to both crime scenes in his possession. A rapid resolution that brought enormous relief to a community that had spent nearly 2 weeks not knowing whether the killer might strike again. Investigators later confirmed the stolen firearms had come from the David residence itself, suggesting Martínez Guzmán had returned to burglarize the property after the killings, connecting the 2 crime scenes even more directly. Facing overwhelming physical evidence, Martínez Guzmán's defense negotiated a plea agreement. In November 2021, he pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder along with related burglary and firearms charges. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty, and the court imposed 4 consecutive terms of life without parole, 1 for each victim, guaranteeing he will never again see the outside of a prison. At sentencing, family members describe 4 ordinary lives: a retired couple and 2 women living independently nearby, extinguished for reasons that, even after the guilty plea, have never been placed on the record. Investigators found no clear prior relationship between Martínez Guzmán and any of his 4 victims, leaving the underlying motive unresolved permanently, even as the legal case itself closed for good. Number 6.
Juan David Ortiz.
The man hunting a serial killer preying on women along the Texas border turns out to be wearing the badge himself. A supervisory agent with United States Border Patrol, sworn to protect the communities along the Rio Grande, secretly uses that same badge, and the trusted commands, to lure vulnerable women into his truck and to their deaths. It takes a 4th victim escaping with her life to finally stop him. This is the story of the Laredo serial killer. Juan David Ortiz was a supervisory agent stationed in Laredo, Texas, holding a position of real trust and authority along one of the busiest stretches of the southern border, and a 9-year veteran of the agency by the time his crimes began. Beginning in September 2018, he began targeting women, several of whom were engaged in sex work locally, luring them into his truck before shooting them and dumping their bodies along rural roads outside the city. In less than 2 weeks he killed Melissa Ramirez, Claudine and Lura, and Guisel Carrion, 3 women whose bodies were found in similar roadside circumstances, initially investigated as isolated, unrelated incidents before the pattern became clear to investigators reviewing the cases side by side. His spree ended only because a fourth intended victim, Erica Pina, managed to escape his truck at a gas station, sensing something was wrong, and ran to a nearby Texas state trooper for help while Ortiz was still in the area. That encounter led directly to his arrest on September 14, 2018, following a tense hours-long standoff after he barricaded himself in a hotel room before finally surrendering to a SWAT team without further violence. The revelation that a Border Patrol supervisor, someone whose badge had likely made his victims feel safer climbing into his vehicle in the first place, was responsible sent shockwaves through Laredo and through federal law enforcement nationally, prompting internal reviews of hiring and oversight within the agency and renewed scrutiny of how officers with access to vulnerable populations are monitored. During the investigation, evidence also tied Ortiz to the earlier death of a fourth confirmed victim, Yanel Ortiz, no relation, bringing his total confirmed victims to 4 women. The case took years to reach trial, but in December 2022, a Webb County jury found him guilty of capital murder on all counts. Prosecutors, who had sought the death penalty, presented evidence, including Ortiz's own recorded interrogation, that he had specifically targeted women he believed society would not miss, and whose deaths he calculated law enforcement would not aggressively pursue, a stated rationale that prosecutors argued proved calculated premeditation rather than a single moment of rage. The jury instead recommended life without parole, which the court formally imposed. Juan David Ortiz surrendered his badge, his career, and his freedom permanently. He serves his sentence today in a Texas state prison, with no possibility of ever walking free again. Number 7. Victor Martinez Hernandez. A 37-year-old mother of 5 goes for her regular evening walk on a familiar wooded trail behind her Maryland neighborhood and never comes home. What investigators uncover afterward, using cutting-edge forensic genetic genealogy, links her death to a crime committed thousands of miles away, and reveals a suspect who had already slipped through federal authorities' hands 3 separate times before he ever reached her trail. This is the story of Rachel Morin. Rachel Morin lived in Bel Air, Maryland, known for her nightly walks on the Maran-Pa Heritage Trail near her neighborhood, a route she reportedly walked almost daily throughout the summer. On the evening of August 5, 2023, she set out on her usual walk and never returned. Her boyfriend reported her missing that night. Her body was discovered the next day in a drainage culvert roughly 150 feet off the trail, having suffered a brutal sexual assault and fatal injuries. Harford County was left reeling, with no immediate suspect and few direct witnesses to work from, and the case initially stalled for months with investigators publicly appealing for any information from the public. The break came through DNA, which investigators matched using advanced forensic genetic genealogy to evidence from an unrelated assault and home invasion in Los Angeles, California, involving a young girl, establishing not only that Rachel's killer had traveled across the entire country but that he had committed at least one other violent attack in the interim. That trail led to Victor Antonio Martinez Hernandez, a Salvadoran national who had entered the United States without authorization in February 2023, just months before the murder. Immigration records later showed he had been apprehended by Border Patrol on 3 separate occasions after unlawfully crossing the border, and that he was also wanted in connection with a homicide in El Salvador before ever reaching Maryland, a criminal history that, once public, became a significant point of political controversy, with then-candidate Donald Trump directly commenting on the case after Martinez Hernandez's conviction. He evaded capture for nearly 10 months, until investigators traced his cell phone activity to a sports bar in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where he was arrested in June 2024. His trial opened in Harford County Circuit Court in April 2025 and lasted 9 days, drawing intense national coverage. Prosecutors presented DNA evidence, digital forensics, and testimony from Rachel's boyfriend and the hiker who found her body, laying out a premeditated, violent attack on a woman simply exercising near her own home. The defense called a single witness and offered no meaningful challenge to the DNA evidence. The jury deliberated less than an hour before convicting him on all 4 counts: first-degree premeditated murder, first-degree rape, third-degree sexual offense, and kidnapping. At sentencing in August 2025, Judge Yolanda Curtin imposed the maximum on every count: life without parole for murder, a second life sentence for rape, and 40 additional years for the remaining charges, all consecutive. Rachel's 5 children each addressed the court. Her oldest daughter told the judge that before her mother's murder, the world had made sense to her, and that it no longer did. Maryland has no death penalty, and prosecutors said publicly that if any case in the county's history warranted one, this was it. But under the sentence the court could actually impose, Victor Martinez Hernandez received the harshest outcome available. He will die in prison, never again drawing a free breath outside its walls, and officials confirmed he will serve his sentence in Maryland rather than being deported back to El Salvador. Number 8.
Jorge Manuel Guerrero Torres.
A 9-year-old girl vanishes from her own home in the middle of the night, in a quiet Florida community. For nearly 4 years, her family doesn't know whether she's alive or dead. When the truth finally surfaces, it comes not from a confession but from a cell phone, and it takes 8 full years for the case to reach any resolution in court at all. This is the story of Diana Alvarez. Diana Alvarez was 9, living with her family in the San Carlos Park area near Fort Myers, Florida, when she disappeared from her home in the middle of the night on May 29, 2016. An Amber Alert went out immediately, and the Lee County Sheriff's Office launched an urgent search alongside state and federal investigators, combing the surrounding neighborhood and waterways for days. Attention quickly turned to Jorge Manuel Guerrero Torres, a family friend who had been staying at the home and had reportedly been asked to leave shortly before Diana vanished. He was arrested within days, in June 2016, though at that point, charged not with her disappearance directly but with possession of child pornography, after investigators found explicit images of Diana on his phone, evidence that made his responsibility for what happened to her unmistakable even though her body had not yet been found. Guerrero Torres was convicted in federal court on the pornography charges and sentenced to 40 years, but the larger question, what had actually happened to Diana, went unanswered for years, a limbo her mother described publicly as its own form of torment, unable to bury her daughter or fully grieve without a body. Investigators eventually traced cell phone location data placing him traveling from Fort Myers towards Central Florida in the immediate aftermath of her disappearance. In March 2020, nearly 4 years after she vanished, surveyors working in a remote wooded area near Yeehaw Junction, more than 100 miles from her home, discovered human remains later identified as hers, finally ending the search but reopening the wound for a family that had waited nearly half a decade for that call. With Diana's remains finally recovered, a Lee County grand jury indicted Guerrero Torres on first-degree murder, kidnapping, and molestation, and the state attorney's office announced it would seek the death penalty. The case moved slowly for years, complicated by a defense motion, ultimately granted, to suppress several of his post-arrest statements on grounds that a language barrier had compromised his understanding of his rights during interrogation, and further delayed by court disruptions during the COVID-19 pandemic. Rather than proceed to a lengthy capital trial with that evidence excluded, prosecutors and the defense reached a plea agreement. In March 2024, 8 years after Diana disappeared, Guerrero Torres pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and kidnapping. In exchange, prosecutors dropped the molestation charge and took the death penalty off the table, and the court imposed a life sentence, structured deliberately to eliminate automatic appeals and spare Diana's family from reliving the case at trial. Her mother, Rita Hernandez, addressed him directly in court, telling him God might forgive him but that she never would. Today, Guerrero Torres must first complete his 40-year federal sentence before beginning his life sentence for Diana's murder, a combination that, as a practical matter, ensures he will never again live outside a prison's walls. Number 9.
Pablo Antonio Serrano Vitorino.
In the span of about 18 hours, across 2 states, 5 men are shot dead. 4 of them are killed by their own next-door neighbor, for reasons that, to this day, have never been explained. The 5th dies the next morning, a total stranger, killed simply because his rural home sat near the path of a man fleeing on foot. This is the story of the 2016 Kansas-Missouri murder spree. On the night of March 7, 2016, 4 men, Michael Capps, Jeremy Waters, and brothers Austin and Clint Harder, were shot to death inside a Kansas City, Kansas, home. All 4 lived at or were visiting the residence, which sat next door to the home of Pablo Antonio Serrano Vitorino, a Mexican national who had been deported once before, in 2004, and had since re-entered the country illegally, avoiding a second deportation the year before the killings only because of a breakdown in communication between local jail officials and federal immigration authorities, after he had been briefly held on a domestic battery charge. One victim managed to call 911 before he died, giving investigators their first clue, but no clear motive was ever established, as police found no evidence of any prior dispute between Serrano Vitorino and his neighbors, despite the men reportedly having a friendly, if casual, relationship as neighbors. He fled in a stolen pickup truck, driving nearly 200 miles east into rural Montgomery County, Missouri. The next morning, March the 8th, he shot and killed Randy Nordman, 49, at Nordman's own rural home near Interstate 70, an apparently random act against a total stranger with no connection to the earlier shootings. The combined spree triggered a massive multi-state manhunt involving helicopters, police dogs, and a SWAT team, with Montgomery County schools placed on lockdown as the search intensified through the day. His truck was found abandoned along Interstate 70, and in the early hours of March the 9th, he was located lying in a ditch nearby, exhausted, and taken into custody without incident, still armed with the rifle used in the killings, having apparently spent hours evading a search perimeter on foot through open farmland. Charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder in Kansas and 1 in Missouri, where prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty, his case moved through years of pretrial proceedings, including a successful defense motion moving the Missouri trial to St. Louis due to pretrial publicity. He never reached that trial. On April the 9th, 2019, more than 3 years after the killings, Serrano Vitorino was found dead in his jail cell, having hanged himself using a light fixture. His death permanently closed both cases without ever producing the courtroom explanation his 5 victims' families had waited years for. There would be no trial, no verdict, no sentencing hearing. Only the certainty that a man responsible for 5 deaths across 2 states would never harm anyone again, having ended his own life in the same cell where he'd waited, for more than 1,000 days, to answer for what he'd done. Number 10. Bryan Kohberger. For college roommates in a small Idaho University town go to sleep after night out, and by morning, their 2 surviving housemates wake to find them stabbed to death. A crime executed so silently that it takes investigators nearly 7 weeks, and a groundbreaking use of public genetic genealogy databases to identify a suspect a continent away. This is the story of the University of Idaho murders. In the early morning hours of November the 13th, 2022, Ethan Chapin, Xana Knodel, Madison Mogan, and Kaylee Gonsalves were stabbed to death inside an off-campus rental home near the University of Idaho in Moscow. 2 roommates survived, having apparently slept through the attack or, in one case, reportedly glimpsed a masked intruder in the hallway without immediately grasping what was happening. A delay in the alarm being raised that meant the crime went undiscovered until nearly midday. The killer left behind one crucial piece of evidence, a knife sheath near one victim, carrying a trace of male DNA that would become the linchpin of the entire investigation. For weeks, the small college town existed in near paralysis, with no suspect identified and the university briefly shifting to remote classes amid fear that the killer remained nearby, local gun and pepper spray sales spiking as residents grappled with the idea that a quadruple murderer might still be walking their streets. Investigators, working with genetic genealogists, used the DNA from a sheath to build a family tree, eventually narrowing in on Bryan Kohberger, a 28-year-old criminology doctoral student at nearby Washington State University, whose own academic focus, chillingly, included the psychology of criminal behavior. Investigators also recovered surveillance footage of a white Hyundai Elantra, a model matching a car registered to Kohberger, circling the victim's neighborhood repeatedly in the hours before the killings. Kohberger was arrested at his family's home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, in late December 2022, more than a month after the murders, after investigators quietly tracked his cross-country movements during a trip home for the holidays. Extradited to Idaho, he faced 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary, with prosecutors initially announcing they would seek the death penalty. The case moved through more than 2 years of pretrial litigation, fights over DNA evidence, alibi claims, a proposed change of venue, before Kohberger unexpectedly accepted a plea deal in June 2025, formally pleading guilty on July the 2nd to all charges in exchange for prosecutors dropping the death penalty and Kohberger waiving any future appeal. At sentencing on July the 23rd, 2025, before a packed Boise courtroom, Kohberger declined to speak or offer any explanation, telling the judge only, "I respectfully decline." Judge Stephen Hippler called him a faceless coward, noting that no rational explanation could ever account for what he had done, and pointedly told the courtroom he did not believe Kohberger's silence deprived the families of anything true, since there was no reason to trust anything the killer might have said regardless. The court imposed 4 consecutive life sentences without parole, 1 per victim, plus 10 years for burglary and several $100,000 in penalties payable to the families. To this day, Kohberger has never stated a motive, and the families of Ethan, Xana, Madison, and Kaylee may never get the answer they've spent years searching for. What they do have, permanently, is the certainty that the man responsible will die behind bars. That closes out today's 10 cases. If this kind of deep dive investigation is what you come here for, hit that like button, drop a comment telling us which case stayed with you the most, and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case so you don't miss the next one.